Look at the feelings that were expressed publicly between President Trump and President Putin. There is no reason for hostility between the United States and the American people and Russia and the Russian people. None. That was made very clear. To put it in the parlance of people down south, we don't have a dog in the fight, okay? Now, here's the kicker. If you, ladies and gentlemen from Europe, are determined to press ahead, that is your privilege. You are sovereign states. You can do it without us. That's what he's got to say. I'm removing our forces. We've got a lot of forces on the border. We still have a lot of people in and out of uniform in Ukraine. I'm getting them out. This war is over. I'm suspending aid to the man in costume here with his little pretend combat uniform. It's over. I'm not going to support this any longer. I've given specific orders to that effect. If that's unacceptable to you, once again, it's your sovereign right to do whatever you think is appropriate, but do not include us because we want nothing to do with it. That's really what he has to say. He can beat around the bush. He can be polite, but that's the message. And the real question is, how long will the globalists in charge last when that becomes clear? I don't think the vast majority of the Europeans have any interest in a war with Russia. I don't think they really believe the Russians are coming. Remember that movie back in the 70s? The Russians,
yeah. Russians are coming. Yeah.
They're not coming. He said, President Putin wants an end to the war. He does. President Putin doesn't want anybody else to die pointlessly. He does. This is over as far as President Trump is concerned. But for him to be effective, he's got to deliver that message to the NATO alliance. Now, you and I have talked about this offline. I think NATO is finished. I think the EU is on crutches. You know, NATO is already a terminal patient on the slab, hooked up to various things to keep it alive. And these people want to give it a haircut and a shave and send it back into combat. It's not going to work. This is a corpse. This is a comatose human being waiting to die. Europe has to move in new directions, divorced from the past. We've reached the historic inflection point, you know, what we call the strategic inflection point. Europe has to become responsible for itself. It has to answer the question, who's going to be your first responder? Because it's not going to be the United States. These are the things that President Trump has to make clear. Will he do that? I don't know. Will he buckle? Will he reconsider and say, well, you know, after I talked to all of our allies, I realized we have to stay. No, come on. It's all nonsense.
Well, and in fact, the allies they certainly have a unified position, because for all the things you saw Ursula von der Leyen, as she was speaking, Zelensky was standing right next to her, and when his turn to speak, he added this.
Putin has many demands, but we do not know all of them. And if there are really as many as we heard, then it will take time to go through them all. It's impossible to do this under the pressure of weapons. So it's necessary to cease fire. The constitution of Ukraine makes it impossible to give up territory or trade land.
So we have the potential there, and I guess you see on the screen there, some of the Europeans are showing up. That's live, I believe, from Washington, D.C. right now. It's Mark Rutte. You have with Zelensky, his comments there, you have the potential there for some conflict, because Trump just less than a week ago mocked Zelensky for saying, oh, my constitution doesn't allow me to give up territory, because Trump said he worked out there's going to have to be some territory swapped to make that happen. And of course, the clear meaning is going to especially be in the Donetsk and Luhansk area, all of Donetsk, which Ukraine would have to withdraw from, the areas where they actually control some of the territory. And instead of acceding to that, Zelensky is entering this conversation saying, yeah, I still ain't doing that. What do you expect from this?
I think it's time for President Trump to say thank you very much for traveling all this distance. I'm glad we had this exchange of views. My position is very clear, and I'm going to make that clear when I make a statement at the end of this meeting. And you are free to go before the press and explain why you can't support my position and why you feel differently. But that's the end of it. Look, the strategic inflection point has been reached. These people want this war to continue because it's critical to their position in office. How do you stand up in front of the Germans, the French, the British, everybody else, say, you know, we've been lying. Russia really isn't interested in a war against us. Russia doesn't want to conquer Eastern Europe. Russia is not this permanent enemy that justifies the existence of this alliance. So under the circumstances, we agree with President Trump. If they did that, it would be over for them. That's the problem. This is existential for them. It's not the threat from Russia. It's the threat inside their own countries, within their electorates. The electorates are going to realize this has been a big scam, and it will be over. Von der Leyen was formerly the defense minister in Germany. So she contributed in a very dramatic way to the destruction of German military power. Then she went on to reinforce the destruction of German national scientific industrial development. This woman is a catastrophe. She's a burden to everyone. She needs to be thrown the hell out of office. And I think all of this will happen if President Trump stands his ground. And forget the Lindsey Grahams and all the other buffoons, because all they're concerned about on the Hill is money. And if we don't do X, Y, and Z and continue this war in Ukraine, what does that do to the defense budget?
Well, yeah, that's a big question that they're going to have to answer there. I imagine they're already going to have some answers about, well, no, we have to get ready for the next war. That's what's going to come. I'm sure they'll have no problem conjuring up something for that. I want to ask you, given the images that Gary's showing there about this short walk from the car inside, you see a small red carpet there. What do you make of the imagery and the setup that in terms of where Trump's mind is and what we might can expect here based on how he greeted President Putin in Anchorage? There was a long red carpet. He was very enthusiastic and greeted him warmly, had lots of good things to say about him. And I haven't seen if there's been imagery out here so far, but the reports were that other than getting out of the car and walking in, that it was going to be more businesslike. When you also look at what Trump tweeted out or in his Truth Social, where he was basically talking to Zelensky like he's talking down to him and Putin as an equal to him, what messages can we get from how Trump is treating the two leaders and what we can expect today?
Remember from the very beginning, as soon as we had these first meetings in Saudi Arabia, President Trump expressed a keen interest in normalizing relations with Russia. Go back to his previous term in office and when he ran for election the first time in 2015, 2016, he was always about normalizing relations with Russia. He asked repeatedly, what is the basis for our hostility towards Russia? I don't see any. He's right. He's right again. And that's really what it's all about for him. I think he knows the truth, although he hasn't stated it publicly, that Ukraine is practically destroyed as a nation state. No one really knows what becomes of it at this point. But I think there's a very real possibility that this rump state that emerges will be very confused and chaotic initially. And I think his view is the Europeans have an obligation to step in there and help. We may also step in with some aid of some kind, but not military aid. As for the rest of it, he was trying to demonstrate to Putin, look, I respect Russia and I respect you and I respect your interests. Until this point in time, no one was ever willing to admit that Russia had any legitimate security interests in Ukraine, or for that matter, anywhere else. He's now said, yes, your security interests are legitimate. People here in the West may not understand that. That's fine, but I recognize you have legitimate security interests. I will respect those. I will work with you to end this conflict. Now, putting the F-22s out there and overflying it, that was stupid. Does he really think the Russians are going to be frightened by it? It's absurd. So that was unnecessary. But I think everything else was a success story. And I think the Europeans are afraid that he's going to do what I said. Now, will he? I just don't know. I really don't. It's hard to tell with him. He's, I want to say, almost mercurial. And when he faces all of these people, will he stand his ground? I don't know. You've got all these people in Washington that want to keep the money flowing. They want to keep the war going. They have an interest in this. In the meantime, I'm sure you saw recently that we were sending naval forces numbering in about 4,000 to the Southern Caribbean, ostensibly with Venezuela as the target destination potentially. You've heard the recent stupid remark by Bondi, who is probably the queen of stupid remarks, saying that there was a $50 million bounty on Maduro's head in
Maduro, yeah.
Venezuela. Well, why is this happening? I think it's also a signal to some extent from Trump that what happens in our hemisphere is most important to us. And to us, that's a real potential threat. What's happening in Eastern Europe isn't. So I think I think that if you look at those two things, you put those together, it seems reasonable to me that Trump will stand his ground. But, you know, he's like everybody else in Washington. They're all wishy-washy. They won't just call the spade a spade. They'll say, well, it's back to being a little bit pregnant. Nobody wants to bear the child, but they all want to be a little bit pregnant to tell everybody they're with them. I hope not. But that's a perennial problem in Washington.
Now, one of the other things I want to talk about here in terms of what we can expect is based on some of the statements by senior administration officials also yesterday. Witkoff raised a lot of eyebrows, especially on Fox News, when he said that Trump had agreed to potentially he said he had agreed that America could provide security guarantees for Ukraine as part of this. He claimed that Putin had authorized that he had agreed to it. And then later in the day, Marco Rubio was also on TV, and he was asked about the same question. Here's what he had to say.
Any security guarantee that, the Europeans, there's a lot they can do and a lot they can offer. And it would be a huge concession. It would be a very big move by the president if he were to offer a U.S. commitment to a security guarantee. That'll be his decision to make. And I want people to understand that. That tells you how bad, if he does it, it tells you how badly he wants peace. Some more work is required before we can say that we have a plan on security guarantees that unifies us.
Yeah. Now, when Shannon Bream asked Witkoff are you talking American boots on the ground potentially for security? He wouldn't answer any of that question and actually changed the subject after it. So neither Witkoff nor Rubio said what they meant. But I mean, just this phrase, security guarantees from the U.S., certainly raised a lot of eyebrows. How do you interpret that?
I don't know the context for the remark completely. I always go back to the Austrian State Treaty in 1955. And Eisenhower effectively said that we would support that Austrian State Treaty. And he meant that he would respect the agreement that the Russians and the Austrians came to at that point in time. And the Austrian State Treaty has always been in the background of many people's minds. I mean, you remember when I wrote several articles on the subject during the first Trump administration over and over and over again. In fact, before that, I know John Mearsheimer has been talking about it. In 2014, I suggested there be a plebiscite in Ukraine and let those who were Russians vote their way into Russia. All of that was, dismissed, and great luminaries in the Senate like Menendez and Ron Johnson and Lindsey Graham all had heart attacks. all that nonsense. Those people are buffoons. They don't know what they're doing. They have a cocktail level of familiarity with reality. A guarantee, if the United States wants to provide it, and I think the Russians would like to be able to say that we are a participant in or supporter of the final arrangement, whatever it is. And that would be neutrality and non-membership for Ukraine with specific limitations on the size of whatever forces remain in Ukraine, along with the presence, I would think, of a Russian representative on the National Security Council in Ukraine. That, by the way, was the case for 20 years in Austria. There was a Russian representative there, and his entire mission was to ensure that the provisions of the treaty were carried out as promised, and they were. So the best deal that he had ever gotten in his life as a Russian diplomat was to live in Vienna, Austria, and the hell out of the Soviet Union. It was a much nicer place to live, but all he had to do was stand there and guarantee it, and it did. I think we could do something like that, but I think Rubio, once again, is the voice of reason here. He's saying guarantee what and with what and how much and for how long. Those are legitimate questions, and they have to be answered before President Trump steps forward and says, I guarantee it. Let's examine this used automobile before we provide any guarantees. And I think that's really what Rubio was saying.